a great tragedy to lose the opportunity to engage those billions of people in these discussions about what we ought to really collectively value as societies.
Well, Daniel Susskind's book is Growth, A History and a Reckoning. We have an excerpt of it at onpointradio.org, and he is a research professor in economics at King's College London. Professor Susskind, it's been absolutely fascinating to talk with you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you so much for having me. Such a pleasure.
I'm Meghna Chakrabarty. This is On Point.
On Point is a production of WBUR Boston and is distributed by APM, American Public Media.
Support for On Point comes from the listeners of WBUR Boston and from BetterHelp, committed to helping clients with issues ranging from relationship challenges and goal setting to grief and depression. Learn more at betterhelp.com/public. And the Elliott Hotel, a boutique hotel in Boston's Back Bay, near major universities, cultural institutions, Newbury Street shopping and dining, and Fenway Park entertainment. ElliottHotel.com.
Almost noon here on 94.9 KUOW, which means it's time for Week in Review with your host, Bill Radke.
Hey there, we've got Week in Review just ahead for you. The hand recount is done on the super close election for Washington State Commissioner of Public Lands. I mean, super close, 49 vote margin. The Democrat goes through to the general election. But wait, was King County's primary election conducted legally? The state Republican Party says no. There is a lawsuit. We're going to discuss that and the rest of the week's news, including what made us smile this week. For me, it was loosely related to public lands management. I'm talking about precision mastication. We'll explain. Just stay tuned for Week in Review.
Support for KUOW comes from the Holocaust Center for Humanity, whose goal is to build courageous communities by teaching lessons of the Holocaust. Presenting the Voices for Humanity Luncheon on September 24th. More info at holocaustcenterseattle.org/VFH.
KUOW FM Seattle, KUOW Tumwater, KQOW Bellingham, self-sustaining service of the University of Washington. Right now, we are under a heat advisory all the way until 11 p.m. tonight. It's 75 degrees at Boeing Field.
A new documentary takes viewers inside the most private of spaces, psychic readings.
This idea of a complete stranger witnessing you and holding up a mirror and telling a story of what they see.
I'm Ari Shapiro. Look into my eyes. My conversation with filmmaker Lana Wilson on All Things Considered from NPR News.
And you can hear that coming up at 3 p.m. with local host Kim Malcolm here on 94.9 KUOW, KUOW.org, and the brand new KUOW app.
Support for KUOW comes from Fujisan Marketing, a locally owned digital marketing agency helping businesses drive revenue and attract new customers through custom SEO, digital advertising, and pay-per-click marketing. Info at fujisanmarketing.com.
Hi, I'm Alex Rochester, the Digital Community Outreach Coordinator here at KUOW, one of the real human people who reads and replies to your questions and suggestions for stories. Help us give the auto-reply robots of the world a break.
Thanks.
And share your feedback and ideas at kuow.org/feedback.
It's 12:01. Week in Review is up after news.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Amy Held. Vice President Kamala Harris has given a rare interview today calling into a radio show on Univision Arizona, a swing state where Latinos now represent 3 in 10 eligible voters. And with the economy polling as a top voter issue, Harris sought to contrast her biography with that of former President Donald Trump.
I come from a middle-class background, raised by a working mother who put all of her hard work into me and my sister Maya. But I will tell you, the tax issue is really pretty basic for me. The billionaires and the biggest corporations can afford to pay more, and they've got to pay their fair share.
Harris and Trump are preparing to debate next week. Trump, meanwhile, held a news conference after his New York court appearance today. He's appealing a $5 million judgment that he sexually abused and defamed E. Jean Carroll. NPR's Stephen Fowler reports.
Trump didn't take any questions and used his lengthy remarks to attack his many court cases, praise his poll numbers, and continue to say he isn't treated fairly. He falsely suggested a decades-old photo of him and Carol could have been AI generated and repeated an argument that he couldn't have committed sexual assault because Carol and other accusers were not attractive to him.
Frankly, I know you're going to say it's a terrible thing to say, but it couldn't have happened. It didn't happen. And she would not have been the chosen one.
Meanwhile, on an unrelated criminal conviction, a judge now says sentencing in Trump's hush money case won't happen until after the election. Stephen Fowler, NPR News.
A North Carolina appeals court has put a stop to the absentee ballots that were supposed to get mailed out today. Instead, they'll remain on hold pending an appeals court review of Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s lawsuit to remove his name as a presidential candidate. He wants his supporters in swing states like North Carolina to vote for Trump.
60 seconds, Kevin.
Israeli forces appear to have withdrawn from the Jenin refugee camp in the Israeli-occupied West Bank. NPR's Kat Lonsdorf reports that Israel's operation lasted for more than a week there and killed dozens of Palestinians.
It was the deadliest military operation in the West Bank since the war began in Gaza last October. At least 39 Palestinians were killed since last Wednesday, according to health officials. 1 Israeli soldier and 3 Israeli police officers were also killed in the fighting. A majority of the Palestinians were killed in Jenin. It was the focus of the operation, which devastated life for civilians there, damaging infrastructure and homes. Nidal Abu Saleh, the mayor of Jenin, tells NPR at least 70% of the city was destroyed. The Israeli military says that the operation, which has not been officially declared over, was targeting militants. Palestinians worry such operations could be an expansion of the war in Gaza. Kat Lonsdorf, NPR News, Tel Aviv.
It's NPR News.
This is KUOW News. I'm Kevin Kniestead in Seattle. The man accused of shooting at least 7 cars along I-5 this week is now facing assault charges. Eric Perkins was formally charged yesterday after police arrested him following the Monday night shooting spree. Prosecutors said he told police he opened fire on people who he thought were trying to run him off the road. At least 5 people were hit by gunfire, and state troopers say they're still hearing from people who have since found bullet holes in their cars. Approximately 1,900 homes served by the Peacock Hill water system in Pierce County are advised to use boiled or bottled water for drinking and cooking until further notice. Washington Water said in a release last night that E. coli bacteria was detected in a water sample taken from a storage tank on September 4th. Both that tank and another receiving water from it were taken offline. No contamination has been found in the system, but follow-up testing was planned for today. As a precaution, chlorine is being added to the other tanks. Customers of the water system are advised to boil tap water for 1 minute before use or use bottled water. 2 athletes with inland Northwest connections won medals yesterday at the Paralympic Games in Paris. Doug Nadvornik from Spokane Public Radio reports.
Taylor Swanson and Jaylene Roberts won silver and bronze in the 100 meters. Swanson, a Seattle native who now trains in Spokane, posted a time of 13.19 seconds. That was more than a half second behind a Chinese sprinter who is the world record holder. Swanson finished a tenth of a second ahead of Roberts, a native of Kent who attended Eastern Washington University. Roberts had already won a bronze medal in the long jump. This is Swanson's first Paralympics and her first medal. She'll compete Friday in the 4x100 universal relay, in which athletes with 4 different disabilities each run 100-meter legs. For Roberts, it's her second Paralympic Games and her 3rd and 4th medals. She won silver in both the 100 meters and the long jump in Tokyo 3 years ago. I'm Doug Nadvornik reporting.
This is KUOW News.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Organic Valley, a farmer-owned dairy cooperative of small organic family farms dedicated to protecting where food comes from. Learn more about Organic Valley at ov.coop. This is NPR.
Welcome to KUOW. Welcome to Friday. Welcome to Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke, and on this show, we're not just rehashing the news. We're hashing it. We're at it this morning. We're calling the state Republican Party about this lawsuit, hashing out what it means. I got Bill Bryant over here talking to the Republican Party chair. Thank you for your service this morning.
Thank you very much for having me on.
Bill Bryant is a business person, a former Port of Seattle commissioner, now a newspaper columnist.
That's right.
Tacoma Tribune, Spokane Inlander. You ran for governor as a Republican
in 2016.
Yep,
with Trump on the ballot.
With Trump on the ballot. Okay, we can talk about that. We got, but I got Brian Callanan here, also talking to the Secretary of State.
Yeah, we got
the
some
Republican Party chair.
Yeah, we got some stuff to talk about with them.
Thank you for your service, Seattle Channel host and producer Brian Callanan, co-host of Seattle News Views and Brews. Alex Hudson. You ran for office, too. Ran for city council.
Hey, Kevin, can I get a count? I missed to turn down. Can you let me know when it's at 18?
Organization that helps get people connected with better ways to get around Seattle.
Thank you for your service. Mm-hmm. Shall we discuss? We had a lot to talk about. Should we get into this top story? And by the way, listeners, you can be viewers because we're streaming the show on YouTube. Just search KUOW. So
at 18 or 19?
I think.
Okay.
Right after he's done with introductions.
Okay, cool. It's at 1848 now.
The fact that a lot of voters around the country question our election legitimacy these days, although investigators and judges keep finding elections are legitimate. But there's a new challenge this week from our state Republican Party. I don't know, is it fair to say, are they questioning the legitimacy of King County's election process?
I think that's exactly what they're doing. Yes.
Okay. Well, let's discuss. I'll give you the background here. We just got the results of a recount in this very, very close election for state public lands commissioner. And the recount found that a Democrat finished second, just 49 votes ahead of a Republican, which means that the Democrat goes on to the general election in November against the first place finishing Republican. We can say more about that. But that's the background to this story. Yesterday, the state Republican Party sued the King County elections director, claiming that the county illegally used a private third-party online tool that helps voters fix problems with their ballot, like a mismatched signature. And the Republican Party claims the use of this private online tool swung the recount, or if you didn't count those votes.
I don't think they're saying it swung the recount. What they're arguing is that under state law, it is illegal for a county to use a third-party for-profit company to cure ballots. That counties under state law have the authority to do that on certain county elections, like conservation districts, for example, but that they are not allowed to use a private, profit-oriented company to cure ballots in a statewide election.
And King County is the only county in Washington doing that,
that's using Omniballot, is my understanding.
Omniballot. This is a private tool run by, I think, Democracy Live is the name of the company, but it's been around for at least 16 years that I could see.
And they've used it for many years too. So
King County has? It's not a new thing?
No, it's
even on statewide elections.
That's my understanding. And so this one got really close. I mean, we're talking about a difference of 51 votes when those final votes were counted. After the curing and the hand recount went on, it went to 49. So I talked to the secretary.
And again, the curing, so listeners know, is when there's a problem. Usually it's a mismatched signature, or you failed to sign the envelope with your ballot. Yeah.
So King County has an online.
You got to make sure that the voter is the voter.
Matches the signature, et cetera. Exactly. Ballot matches the signature. So I talked to the Secretary of State's office this morning, and it's one of these issues where they're really trying to focus on the bottom line here, which is this is a process that worked. We thought it was 51. It turned into 49. And
remarkably accurate.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. And after a hand recount, the closest election in our state's history, I should point out, after that, we still got down to this 49 number. And so this challenge that the state Republican Party is pushing through, I talked to Jim Walsh as well today.
The Republican Party
Party chair, thank you. And so he is definitely he didn't want to say we have a corrupt system or anything along those lines. He's just saying there's a transparency issue here, and the way that this tool was used is not the way it should be used. And so he was even saying
illegal?
Well, that's what his lawsuit is saying.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So if it's not a situation where this vote gets changed in some way, he is saying, let's make sure we fix this going forward. So I think he's looking ahead with this as much as anything else.
They're not going to overturn the results of
I really don't think
primary
so.
election.
I really don't think so.
No, not at all. And I think it's important to say, okay, so what is this process? What is curing ballots? It's not like you just run a piece of software over people's, ballot or the elections database and come up with errors. It tells you this ballot, just like anybody can go on the King County website and enter your date, your birthday, and your name and get your voting record and track your ballot. This is just a way for people to say, hey, there's a mismatch in this ballot. A voter who absolutely intended to cast a ballot and for one reason or another just missed a final step to get it all the way there.
I might sign my name Bill instead of William or William instead of Bill.
I've gotten notification from the elections when I was, too hasty in signing my name that it didn't match as well. And I was really grateful for the opportunity for the system to re-enfranchise me by letting me know that I needed to do something about that. So all this does is say, hey, here's the list of folks who intended to cast ballots, who had made decisions about who they wanted to vote for and weren't able to do that. I consider this to be the most sophisticated and granular way that we can make sure that everybody who wants to vote can.
Yeah, and to be clear, it is not illegal to use a online system to help voters cure their ballots. In all the examples we've had, you sign it Bill instead of William, or you inadvertently put the wrong number on your street apartment number or whatever. That is all legally done online. Under state law, that must be done directly between the voter and the county. And in King County, they have a for-profit third party administering it, and that's what the Republican Party says is illegal. No one is claiming that there was a problem with this company, I don't think. It's just that under state law, it shouldn't happen. So,
but why is that a post-recount lawsuit, though?
Because those ballots would have been included by a organization that legally should not be involved in the process.
And I should also point out they had to wait for that recount to be finished before there was legal standing to jump in and actually make a complaint in a lawsuit like this. So that's part of it too.
But this is about whether theoretically a judge, if a judge sided with the state Republican Party, then what we would be talking about is, hey, we're not going to King County will no longer be able to use this private for-profit third party tool in what, the November election or future elections?
And any statewide election is my understanding.
Potentially, yeah. Or they could rule and say, yes, it is okay to use it. I mean,
yeah.
I'm not sure where that's going, but just one last point of perspective here, Bill, that I thought about with this. This is a very different situation from where we were in 2020, for example. You remember Lauren Culp? He was the Republican candidate for governor there. He challenged the election results, filed a lawsuit, said there was widespread problems throughout the system there. That case got thrown out. The lawyer that represented him was disbarred. The group that brought it forward was fined. So we're not talking about a complaint that is something broad and saying our whole system is corrupt or anything along those lines at all. This is something more specific, and I think having that perspective is important.
And I would just like to say that may be true, but the intent and the impact are two very different things, right?
Yep.
Bill, you started by saying voters are increasingly hesitant to trust the election system. I bristled a little bit because those are some pretty passive verbs there. They're not just that's not coming from nowhere. That is a very concentrated, well-funded, deliberate attack on the perceptions of the integrity of our election system. And so to have the first statewide hand recount since 1960 go remarkably well to prove that our system is entirely accurate. And the Republicans still have a nominee on the ballot. So it is hard to imagine a scenario where this is anything other than just throwing more mist, whether they'll say it or not, at the idea that people cannot trust our election system, when another way to interpret this is that our election systems are extraordinarily durable and reliable. And I resent that as a voter.
Yeah. Let me put that to you, Bill, Republican Bill Bryant. Even if the Republican Party is not saying, in this case, this year, the election's fraudulent, it's stolen. That's not what's being said. Let's say, I don't know if this is true, I don't know Jim Walsh, but let's say the Republican Party they would have loved to have two Republicans get through so that there will be a Republican lands commissioner. We can talk about why that matters in a moment. Instead, in a close election, even though the Democrats split their vote 5 ways, they failed to stop a Democrat from getting through and possibly being the next state lands commissioner. So could the state Republican Party chair just be, if nothing else, looking like he's doing something, sort of a diversionary, because we could talk about let's you know what, we really should change this going forward. We shouldn't have this private third-party tool, but a lawsuit saying that this is a lawsuit right after the manual recount, doesn't that have the effect of continuing to muddy the waters about whether we can trust our election system?
If the state party is going to file a lawsuit, it had to do it now. It would not be able to do that in 5 or 6 months into the next year. It needed to be done now. If the Republican Party or if Jim Walsh, the county chair, thought that he could go to King County and say, hey, this was done illegally and you shouldn't be using this for-profit company in a private or in a statewide election, and he thought that King County would pay attention to him, well, maybe we could. But I think that the Republican Party chair going to King County saying you need to change the way you're doing something is not going to get very far. He probably feels he needs a judge to tell them to not do this going forward.
Yeah. But to Alex's point, I mean, we're talking about it, right? This is something that potentially could sow distrust of our election system. And I think that's something that certainly the state Democrats are very concerned about. And that's what they're really saying with this, too. So there's a lot to this. I want to make sure that a judge makes a decision here, which I imagine might happen as early as today. I've heard that from the state Republicans, potentially.
Okay.
We'll see.
That'd be great, because we don't want this hanging over the election.
No, not at all.
And the Secretary of State needs to get ballots out.
That's
for
true
November,
too.
for the November election.
Yeah.
Okay, and just real quick, is the fact that King County mostly votes Democrat, is that a factor in this lawsuit? We're not talking about a Republican county doing this, or is that unrelated?
Well, I think it's,
is this a partisan?
It's in King County where those votes would have tipped the balance statewide. So this is where there is the harm or the purported harm. And that's where you would need to bring the case where there was actual demonstration of possible harm.
Okay.
Yeah, I would also say that I think that this potentially has a lot to do with the fact that, there was 2 Republicans and a Democrat who were in the top 3. Former Congresswoman Jamie Herrera Butler, who's a longstanding Republican, who did not receive the endorsement of the Republican Party,
who voted to impeach Trump.
Right.
Yep.
Thanks to her for that bravery and taking that vote of integrity. But Cool Peterson, who had been the other Republican, did receive the Republican endorsement. And so, is it about King County being a Democratic? Is it about like, we got a Republican, but not ours, the one that we wanted, that kind of infighting within the Republican Party over which candidates they want to elevate, I think is something to remind ourselves as well.
So regarding why it matters whether a Democrat or a Republican is the state commissioner of public lands, this job, they oversee, among other things, the sale of timber on state forest land, which pays for things like school construction. And there's a debate over how much forest we should cut and sell versus preserve. Forests absorb greenhouse gases and they're good for groundwater, et cetera. The Democratic candidate who got through, Dave Upthegrove, calls himself the Green candidate and said he wants to preserve legacy forests, which are older but not old growth forests. This is about 3% of state-owned forests. And opponents, including Jamie Herrera Butler, his opponent in November, say that over-restricting logging not only costs schools if you're not selling that timber, but it could increase fuel for wildfires. Is that a short take on what the voter is choosing between in November?
You could call it that. I mean, that's the debate that's been going on with forest management for decades. And if that's the split, I think I think you've got that basic concept there. Sorry, Alex.
Go ahead.
If the Republican Party cares so much about how we fund our public school systems, then I'd love to see them not running ballots that would undermine the construction, maintenance, and operations of our schools by trying to repeal a very popular capital gains tax that fewer than 1,500 people in the state of Washington pay.
There is also a climate issue underlying all of that. Yeah. And it's actually a good scientific argument that I think needs to be had, or discussion that needs to be had more broadly than it is. And that is, on one side, some of my good friends in the environmental community will argue that we need to protect some of these second or third growth forests that are still significant in terms of girth, and they're big trees, but they are not native, pre-Columbian. We need to protect those for reasons related to climate and carbon sink.
Yeah.
There is another argument that has some scientific merit, or a lot of scientific merit, and that is these trees secure and harbor carbon in the early part of their life cycle. But once they become mature, every year they're absorbing less and less because they're mature trees. And that if we really are concerned about harvesting carbon or sequestering it, we need to log these trees when they are mature and plant new ones that begin sucking carbon all over again. So there's a legitimate climate-related issue here on whether or not it's good to keep large trees standing, which, if they catch fire, release the carbon anyway, or should we capture that carbon in wood products?
That wildfire issue is the one that I think is front and center. And we didn't have as bad a season this year, I think you could argue, which I think would have been an interesting thing to talk about with regard to this race and the climate act there that people are trying to repeal as well. So yeah, I have my eye on that issue for sure. Climate Act going forward into the November election.
Yeah, and carbon sequestration is so vitally important for the carbon that's already been released into our atmosphere, and we all know that this is a record-breaking heat year. And as have been the last 5 sequential years before it, but we should be focusing on prevention of carbon getting into our atmosphere in the first place.
Well, we need to do both.
Yeah, and so I think these kind of questions about logging, Brian, you're totally right. I wrote my senior thesis about logging and the labor movement in Washington State. These issues go way, way, way back, and the Public Lands Commissioner is so vitally important for issues around grazing and agriculture, issues around what is going to be happening with our the dams and the movement.
Tidal lands.
Yeah.
We forget about this, but DNR also has control over the tidal lands.
Yes. Okay, this is a former Port of Seattle commissioner.
Just so you know.
Speaking,
Yeah.
so you know.
Right.
Okay, so to wrap this part up, despite this lawsuit, none of us expect there to be any change in the fact that Democrat Dave Up the Grove is going to face Republican Jamie Herrera Butler for Lands Commissioner in November. Before we take a break, one more thing. We would not have had this chaos if we just separated our Republican and Democratic primaries, but we don't. We have an open primary. You could call it a blanket primary. You could call it a top 2 primary, or
jungle.
You could call it a jungle primary. Sounds way more fun.
I was waiting for the Guns N' Roses to get started there. Yeah, right.
Welcome to the primary. Unlike most states, our Washington primary ballot looks a lot like a general election ballot where you can vote for anyone you want because it's nonpartisan. Therefore, some political analysts say the way we vote for federal offices in our August primary is a bellwether. Anybody know where the word bellwether comes from, by the way?
Means the weather's good, so they hit a bell. What do we got?
That's incorrect. It's a sheep term. The sheep that walks in front of the pack wearing a bell around its neck, and the others hear the bell and follow behind it.
Thank you.
So if this is true, if we are a bellwether, then our August voting could say something, and the conventional wisdom that I could glean is that it would indicate Democrats' chances in November are moderately good. But do you buy this premise that our Washington State is a bellwether, even though we're not a swing state?
I do, and it's also not just because of where our state is, but I guess I would say where our state falls in the primaries. They're a lot later than most of the other states, and so
that's true.
This is after a lot of results have come in. So it's almost like people have digested that news. They've seen the polls. They've seen some results already. So is this something that could be a better indicator? I think so, just based on the timing of the vote. I think that's what's interesting about it.
I continue to believe that modeling to me feels almost like mathematical therapy, right? We're all so desperate to know what's going to happen in the future. Election anxiety is so high. And the article that you're referencing, Bill, was talking about a crystal ball. And I just can't help but feel like, man, you can run a model that can show all kinds of different things. And really what we're really looking for is assurances about the future. And it really does feel like one step away from tarot card reading.
One thing, too, is that, and this is just based on personal experience through campaigns, I think that in August, you have people who care about elections voting, but those who really don't like politics, who aren't that engaged, who are trying to get their kids ready to go to school or cram in one last vacation, do not vote in the primary.
Right.
And that those people who are probably independent, persuadable, but lean D, but they're persuadable, will vote in November. And so I'm not saying that's going to turn the election around, but it will tighten up as those people, largely between Lake Stevens and Auburn, decide to start paying attention and vote.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll see what. So should we see what actually happens when people vote in November?
That's usually the best way.
Not a bad way.
I like it.
Okay.
And then we can just look back and be like, all of our predictions were accurate, and I totally saw this coming.
Well, when we come back, I mean, here we've already talked about carbon and the climate and state initiatives. So let's say a little more about where that's going after we take a break here on Week in Review. Come right back.
Support for KUOW comes from HopeLink, presenting their 29th annual Reaching Out Luncheon with keynote remarks by Stephanie Land, author of Made, Hard Work, Low Pay, October 21st from noon to 1 at Maidenbauer Center in Bellevue and streaming online. Registration available at hopelink.org.
94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. Expect a high of 88 today. We are under heat advisory.
On the next Radio Lab, two strangers are matched for a bone marrow transplant and discovered that's about all they had in common.
Maybe this guy's like a real piece of crap.
That's on the next Radio Lab.
That's coming up Sunday at 3 p.m. here on KUOW.
Hi, I'm food and drink writer Ton Venn, here to tell you about a new podcast from KUOW and the Seattle Times. It's called Seattle Eats. I'll be your host and personal guide across our vibrant local food scene. So let's eat. Our first episode drops Thursday, September 19th on the KUOW app or wherever you get podcasts.
KUOW's Week in Review. I'm Bill Radke, and I'm glad to have Alex Hudson here, who's the executive director of Commute Seattle, with Seattle Channel host and Seattle News, Views, and Brews podcast host, Brian Callanan, and former Port of Seattle Commissioner, newspaper columnist Bill Bryant. So we're already talking about elections here. Washington State's biggest greenhouse gas polluters had another auction this week, and it could be their last, depending on what you, the voter, decide in November, because we've got this fairly new climate law in Washington State that sets up this carbon auction. Big emitters, like oil companies, either have to cut their emissions or buy allowances at an auction. They're bidding on the right to pollute, and the money goes to state government. So there's an opportunity to repeal this law. The opponents of the law got enough signatures to put this and other initiatives on the ballot in November. So what are the odds that voters, we were just talking about who doesn't care enough to vote when their kids are about to go back to school and they're having summer vacation. Now we're going to have a different crowd coming out in November. Is Washington State about to repeal this climate change law? And then we can talk about what effect that might have.
It certainly could. I know this polled in a positive way in May, which was just a few months ago, definitely in different terms right now.
And in July.
Thank you. But I guess what I'm seeing with this is a mantra from this group, Let's Go Washington, who funded this initiative and many others to put them on the ballot and get the signatures, et cetera. They're going with this very simple mantra of vote yes, pay less. They've made a connection with 2117 here, this measure we're talking about, such that, hey, if we have these climate measures in place, and that's what's making your gas so expensive, that's what's making heating your home so expensive, so we need to repeal it. It's a very simplistic way, I think, of looking at this and looking at our climate too. But I think in a lot of ways that could be something that people get behind. I'm not saying that they will. I know there's a lot of money going in there to try to make sure people do not support that way of thinking. But that's kind of what's behind this. And I think there should be cause for concern if you're concerned about climate policy in the state of Washington.
Okay. That's been Week in Review. We're going to wrap up early.
Yeah.
I thought there'd be some.
Drop the mic.
Well,
I thought there'd be some. So this is one of the funders, a company opposing the repeal.
Yeah, they're voting yes on a repeal. That's the tough part.
Yeah, this company wants you to say no and keep this climate law in place, and that is British Petroleum, which is an oil company that has to pay to pollute under this law. Bill, why would British Petroleum say, let's just keep this carbon auction system in this law in place?
For two reasons. One, corporations don't like regulations, but they can deal with them if they're predictable and stable. What corporations do not like is an unpredictable and stable regulatory environment, because that precludes them from making long-term budget decisions and long-term investments.
Like investing in the auction that you were just talking
Right,
about.
or even, deciding they're going to put resources into this renewable because it's going to become more profitable,
Yep.
given the scenario in Washington State. But if the carbon policy in Washington State is in flux, then they don't know how to make long-term budget decisions or investments. So part of it is just a corporate decision-making structure where tell us what you want us to do and we'll figure out how to work within those guidelines. The other part, and I don't think this is insignificant, is that in this particular case, they're not paying the costs. They're bidding for these credits, but then they are passing on that cost to the consumer at the gas pump or in the for heating oil.
I've never understood this, because if it's that easy to pass on the cost, why aren't they charging the most they can get away with as it is?
Well,
It doesn't, I don't suddenly have
I
more
think
money
it's
to
pretty
spend
well
on.
accepted now that gasoline has gone up 35 to 50 cents a gallon. What I find interesting on the part of the governor and some of the other people who are opposing this is initially they were trying to argue that that wasn't the case, that it really hadn't gone up. Or if it had gone up, it wasn't because of this initiative. When frankly, I think they ought to be embracing it, but they haven't built the consensus to accept that. But
Say, hey, let's all pay more for gas as
well,
a way
essentially,
of transitioning
you need to say
renewable.
if we're going to move towards a post-fossil fuel economy, we need to internalize some of the pollution costs of fossil fuels, and that means you're going to have to pay more in order to incentivize the private sector to invest in alternatives. But you can't do it too quickly. It's a soft landing deal, because you can't raise the cost when people don't have an alternative yet, because that's just pushing them to the edge of the cliff and then pushing them over. You've got to have an alternative that they can easily adapt. And where I put a lot of blame, and this won't come as a surprise to most people, but I put it at Jay Inslee's doorstep, because we have squandered 12 years when we should be moving forward aggressively on climate. And instead of doing that, he has failed to build a consensus in this state behind a climate strategy. Both the two major pillars, the carbon market and the natural gas phase out, were both pushed through. Natural gas at 2 a.m., twisting arms and holding noses. Even a lot of the Democrats weren't supporting it. Certainly the Republicans, who had some options, were totally left out of the room. And so he's pushed them through without building a popular consensus for it. And that's why we have over 1 million individuals, distinct individuals, signing this petition saying they want the opportunity to vote to reject or accept this policy. If he had spent 10 or 12 years explaining to people why we need to be investing in new technology and why we need to move to a post-carbon economy
and pay more for gas,
and why you're going to have to pay more for gas, and then maybe listen to some of the opposition and brought in some of their ideas, he could have built broad-based support and maybe even a legacy.
Okay.
But now that's at risk in November.
This man ran for president on a climate platform, so I feel that very few people in our country have done more to elevate the importance or to center the need for a sustainable climate future and the transition towards renewable energy than Jay Inslee. And he has signed some of the most nation-leading legislation that does exactly that. And on behalf of my daughter's children, I'm very grateful to him for leading that way. It is never true that any public policy change is going to be broadly popular, and the fetishization of broad consensus is what holds our politics back in this state. I think that what we need to be doing is telling more people not only, yes, what is it that you're paying? Be honest with people about that. Although I think that the blame for that really lies at the hands of the oil companies who set the prices. But what they're getting, right? Like this, Bill, you said the revenue goes to the state government. That's not Yes, but the state government's not just like a bank account, right? It spends money that benefits the public. Obviously, I was very deeply involved in the construction of Move Ahead Washington, the transportation package that spends quite a bit of the CCA money on things that really matter to people. The alternatives that you're talking about, we have given every person under the age of 19 in the state of Washington gets free transit. This is the only state that is doing that, and it is cascaded a wave of access to opportunity for young people across our country. We're investing in things like air quality monitors. We're investing in the transition to solar power. We're putting that money back in the hands of people in the state of Washington and making it so that their children can breathe clean air. I think that if there's anything that we need to do better is to explain to people the benefits that they're receiving right now, not just, abstractly 20 years in the future.
I don't know if you want to turn this into a debate over this initiative, but
we have other things to cover because
But I can
review
argue
the whole
that
week's news.
one of the reasons so many people are opposed to this initiative is that they do not like the way and they do not trust the way the money is being spent. That a huge amount, millions of dollars, are going to non-government organizations, community organizations that are spending the money in ways that will have no impact on carbon emissions. Zero. I mean, I can.
But we do have a lot of programs where the way the money is spent is not necessarily.
This is seen. You have to understand from the Republican perspective. Many see this as a way to collect money from the public and to dole it out to organizations that support the governor and the Democratic Party. And when you look at the number of grants that are being distributed, that bears out. These, for example. $500,000 to the African Community Housing for workshops.
Okay.
$650,000 for Asian Pacific Cultural Center to hire staff to help them engage with state agencies.
So, Brian, is that unusual for money to be distributed in that from one source into programs like that?
And this is definitely the Republican pushback.
It's
I've heard that in a
totally
lot of different ways.
Republican
But I will say this: as much as I appreciate what you're saying, Bill, we have a situation right here where British Petroleum is a group that supports this. The Western States Petroleum, they don't want this initiative. And a big reason for that is not only are they moving towards a greener energy source, which I think is a good thing to keep track of here, they just want to make sure that we're negotiating these things. We're not using this blunt tool of an initiative to try to decide these things, which I am all in favor of initiatives here, but I think any of the people who are involved, who I would argue have really been working towards building some sort of consensus over the past decade plus. I mean, remember, BP in 2016 and 2018 was against some of these greener measures. Now they're for it because they can see where the future is going. So I definitely see that piece of it here. And I guess using the initiative, I just think is really difficult because rather than trying to negotiate something, we've got a sledgehammer right in the middle of it, which, yes or no, it's just going to cause a number of issues.
The only reason why there's an initiative is because we didn't reach out and try and incorporate some of these other views during the legislative process. And had we not tried to push these through at 2 a.m. by 1 or 2 or 5 votes.
Talking about the natural gas issue.
Well, there were like 7 initiatives or something.
No, but we're talking about the 2 climate ones.
Yeah.
If we had actually gone out and helped people understand why this is important, I actually support a carbon market. And I think we ought to be pulling in this money. I just want it spent in ways that will actually help us reduce carbon emissions in Washington State. I want
a one-to-one relationship.
I want to see us investing in new technologies, and I want some accountability on how these dollars are being spent. If the Democrats and people like me really do believe that climate change is an existential threat and a threat to our national security, we shouldn't be spending millions of dollars on listening sessions. We should be spending money on research and development of new technologies which are going to help us capture and reduce emissions.
Okay. Any more on this before we switch topics and keep moving? Because we've got between now and November to keep discussing this initiative.
Yeah.
And 3 others on the ballot. Okay, so before we take a break, I want to note that Seattle Public School students went back to class this weekend in Everett and Puyallup and lots of others. And in Seattle, the district's got extra money for safety. There have been school shootings lately. Brian, how different do Seattle schools seem this year because of these initiatives?
I think they will be different. Definitely the first day of school, there's a lot more police activity on the outside of schools, which I think is something visible and tangible that people appreciate, certainly in neighborhoods like Garfield, who had one of those shootings that you're referring to recently where a student was actually killed on campus. You'll also see more of these community groups like community passageways The Yellow Jacket guys, they're actually escorting kids in some cases from the school to their homes and things of that nature, or to the bus, so that handoff can be happening in a different way there. You'll also see within the school itself, there's going to be more mental health counselors. There's going to be more outreach to kids so they can try to do the short-term issue, if you want to call it a short-term issue, or the more visible issue of having a police presence, and also the longer-term work of making sure kids are taken care of, because they're feeling, I've talked to my kids about it too. It's a really difficult thing to grow up in a world where you're doing active shooter drills. I didn't do that when I was a kid. My kids are, and that's a very different thing for them. So there's a lot of important work going on there too. It's a joint effort between the City of Seattle and Seattle Public Schools. There's about $14.5 million being invested here, and we'll have to see what happens over the next several months here, but there is definitely a more visible and tangible effort to invest and show that investment in public safety on and around campuses in Seattle.
And I think it's a great start. I think that there are almost nothing that is more important than the viability and the safety of our children, and dealing with the teen mental health crisis, which has been declared a pandemic by the Attorney General of the Surgeon General of the United States, and you're a dad, you feel it with your kids. Great start. And we need to be closing some of the gaps that are causing this crisis in the first place. One of the things that I think is a real improvement, and I'm the mother of a teenage girl, is putting those cell phones away in class.
Here we go.
I'm no one's more a fan of that than me.
My kids have to put theirs in a pouch at the beginning of the day and unlock it at the end of the day.
Yeah, and that's
starting this year.
Totally fine. And the connection between the cell phone and their mental health cannot be clear as can the connection between the presence of the cell phone and academic success. I also think we need to do things like acknowledge that in our Seattle public school system, upwards of 10% of students are homeless. Next year, we're going to be doing another Families and Education Promise Levy. I think that it should not be that challenging to ask our city to commit to zero youth homelessness. I think that I would love to see our Democratic state legislature invest in free public school breakfast and lunch so that kids can learn without being hungry.
Bill Bryant's nodding his head.
I am nodding my head yes.
We've just got a ton of kids who, in the background of their day, before they even get to school, are overcoming things that would.
I remember
paralyze adults.
Talking to a principal in Spokane during my gubernatorial campaign, and she said, "Look, I've got kids who are sleeping in their garage in their grandmother's, in the car in their grandmother's garage, and they're coming to school with toothaches. And these kids get themselves to school, and they're coming, but they've got a toothache." She goes, "How does that kid learn?" Now, you can argue it's not the school's responsibility to take care of their dental hygiene, or really where they're living. But it is our job to teach those kids, and we can't ignore the underlying reasons they're not learning. So whether we think it's appropriate or not, maybe we need to change what's appropriate and get involved.
That's right. I'm not going to let appropriateness or jurisdictional battles between government agencies get in the way of a kid not getting a dental checkup.
Well, yeah, and I'm the first to start talking about how across the state, more than 50% are not learning at grade level.
Yeah.
And if you start asking teachers why, there are some reasons related to this dysfunctional World War II learning system that we have. But in addition to the lack of reform is the fact that a lot of these kids do not have English as their primary language, or are homeless, or are hungry. And you can argue that, well, that's beyond the scope of education reform. Well, if you're really concerned about helping kids learn at grade level, maybe we ought to get involved in those issues.
Yeah, and you talk about those boundaries or whatever else, Alex. I think that's a really important point, and I think we're seeing it here with the city of Seattle, this investment that is made between the city and the school district. That's important. There's, of course, that state element on top of it as well, which makes it a little more confusing, but I think that is the bottom line for parents I've talked to about this. They want to make sure their kids are safe, they want to make sure they're learning, and they want to make sure that it's equitable, too, so that these kids who are homeless, kids who are speaking different languages, things of that nature, there's a lot to consider here. And this whole concept of public safety and public education, those two things go hand in hand. You can't really separate them, I don't think.
No, I couldn't go to my job. So my daughter went to Garfield High School last year, and there were 5 shootings in and around the school, culminating with a homicide of a young person who was robbed of their life. And I couldn't go to my job. If there were 5 shootings outside of Commute Seattle in a year, I wouldn't go to my job anymore. And we ask 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds to endure that. It's bananas. Two other things I think we really need to do, because the Seattle public school system obviously cannot solve gun violence, and neither can the city of Seattle. But what we can do is we can follow the data about what reduces youth violence. Another program that we should be deeply, deeply, deeply investing in is our teen centers, our community centers. Like, these places should be absolutely overflowing with programming, drop-in programming, mentorship, educational opportunities, kind of filling that gap through our parks system for sure. And then the other thing is, like, the science is very clear that what stops bullets is jobs. And like, we need to be investing in the opportunities for every kid who wants one to be able to get a job through the municipality or elsewhere, so that kids have the opportunity to kind of be somewhere and start building a life worth living.
But that goes back to education performance. You can't have more than 50 to 60% of kids not learning at grade level, but graduation rates going up, which actually means we are continuing to graduate kids who have not mastered basic math and language skills, and then expect them to go get a job. We've got to make sure these kids are leaving high school with some sort of skills and basic math and language. And I would even argue reinvent the last 2 years of high school so that those who don't intend to go to university can begin learning a trade and leave with some sort of certificate that allows them to go get a good union job.
That's back to school this week on KUOW's Week in Review. We're not quite done discussing all that happened this week, so when we come back from a break, we'll hit some other highlights or lowlights, stuff you ought to know about what happened this week and what it means on Week in Review. Don't go away.
Hi, I'm NPR's Shannon Bond. As we head into the 2024 election, what's keeping our elections safe and accurate? Join me September 11th for a special live event in Seattle as we explore these questions and more. Get tickets today at kuow.org/events.
KUOW Live Events, sponsored by Finney Ridge Painting and BECU.
Some of the tools people used to use at work, like fax machines and ledger cards, barely exist anymore. We'll reminisce about when old technology was new next time on Marketplace.
And that's coming up at 2:30 and 6:30 today here on 94.9 KUOW. Weekend Review continues in just a moment.
Hi, I'm Kim Malcolm, local host of All Things Considered. We're all looking to make the best use of our time, and that's what we do weekday afternoons. You can count on hearing from some well-informed people about what happened today and why it matters, and you get a chance to connect to something different, like the best in music, arts, and books. It's all there for you weekday afternoons starting at 3 here on KUOW.
We are discussing the week gone by on Week in Review. I'm your host, Bill Radke. We've got Commute Seattle's Alex Hudson here, Seattle Channel's Bryant Callanan, and newspaper columnist, former Republican state gubernatorial candidate. So he knows about elections that we've been discussing a lot today. That's Bill Bryant. We're going to wrap up some stories that we haven't mentioned yet. Just for one thing, a colleague of mine hasn't lived here very long, and he asked me, how come people aren't more freaked out about a mass shooting on Interstate 5, which made me stop and think, because it really didn't change how I feel about the freeway somehow. And so in case you didn't hear this, now a 44-year-old man's been arrested and accused of, this is unproven, so it's an allegation that on Monday night he drove up and down I-5 in King and Pierce counties, shooting at least 6 cars, starting around 8:30 in Federal Way, heading north, and that happened in Seattle, MLK at I-90, then back in Federal Way southbound, and then South Tacoma. A driver and passenger shot in the leg, somebody shot in the neck, 3 people in the hospital at last I've heard, 1 in critical condition. The State Patrol spokesperson, Chris Loftus, said on KUOW News, 1 victim didn't even know it was a gun. They figured somebody was throwing rocks. Troopers got a description, a white Volvo, California plates. They saw the car pull into an apartment complex in Tacoma, and then he drove away, and they set up those spike strips and arrested him. And the state patrol captain said the suspect told troopers that he thought people were following him, trying to run him off the road and stealing his identity. And so this trooper talked about just this being not just an attack on those individuals, but an attack on everybody. So I was wondering if, with his colleague saying, why aren't we all freaked out? What did you make of? Did you feel less safe because of yet another shooting, but more unusual than usual?
I think this kind of violence, the random stranger-based violence, is obviously the most terrifying, right? That you could just be minding your own business and something like this could happen is rightfully very alarming. I noted as we were prepping for this earlier this week, this is my 4th time on Week in Review, and every single time we have had to talk about an incidence of gun violence. This is become to the point. Danny Westneat, I think, wrote a good article about this, and he
in the Seattle Times.
In the Seattle Times, about whether or not we've become too accepting of this. And I don't know anybody who accepts this. I think that we're hopeless, feel hopeless. Like, what can you do? Like, this is America. It is daily incidents of random gun violence. This against strangers is the backdrop of the country that we live in. So I don't know that anybody's accepting it. I just think that people have absolutely no idea what to do.
And I never want to say it's normal.
No.
It's a normalized piece of it. But we are talking about incidents that happen all the time. This one was frightening, a random situation. We had that school shooting in Georgia just a couple of days ago, too. And it does... I'm with you, Alex. I feel like we are hearing about it every day. I think it's important to talk about it. I think it's important to try to speak to some of these different ways that we can reduce gun violence in our country. But it does feel crippling sometimes. I don't know what to do. I am going to keep driving on the freeway, and I am going to hope for the best. And I am going to try to support measures that reduce gun violence. That's what I feel like the limits of what I can do.
Well, regarding that school, this is a high school shooting outside Atlanta, and 4 people were killed, 9 people hurt. A 14-year-old was charged with murder, but so was his father for involuntary manslaughter and second-degree murder for letting his son have a weapon. Apparently, police got these tips last year about online threats and interviewed the suspect and his father. The boy said, I didn't make those threats. And the dad said, my son does not have unsupervised access to our hunting rifles. And police, all they could do was tell schools to monitor the kid. And that was it. In Washington, we have extreme risk protection orders, also known as red flag laws. So police or family members can try to get a court order to take somebody's guns away. I think the parent could block that order, which it sounds like this dad might have been inclined to do. So I don't know what would have happened in Washington State.
Yeah, but just a deeply traumatized people, and there are way too many guns in this country.
Before we're just about 5 minutes left in the show, I wanted to mention a few other things that came up this week, and Bill and I were talking about this before the show started. Some big news from the Seattle Symphony, and that is that the orchestra says it has hired Xian Zhang as its new music director, the symphony's first female director and first woman to head a major West Coast orchestra.
Yeah, I didn't know anything about her, but my good climbing buddy is an assistant principal chair in the Cleveland Orchestra. And so I called him to see whether or not this was a big deal or not. And he said, no, this is a big deal. I mean, within the orchestra symphony community in the United States and Europe. She apparently was recognized at a very early age in Europe and the U.S. and was invited to conduct it in some of the most prestigious symphonies around the world. He said, a few years ago, there were not very many female musicians, let alone conductors. And even in just the last 10 years, there have not been that many. That Seattle is one of the first to hire a female conductor of such prestige, the other one being in Baltimore. So he said, she is incredibly accomplished, and kudos to Seattle for doing this.
I just like hearing some good news about the symphony because they, like many other arts organizations, got absolutely hammered during the pandemic. So to see that there is some light ahead and there is some fresh new excitement around the symphony, I think is super news.
Yeah, I think people should buy tickets
Here we go.
and go and support the arts all across our city, because loving them from afar is not enough to keep them open.
And the fact that this job was open was a strange. The symphony, the last music director left very suddenly.
In a messy
and
way.
He didn't feel safe.
Right.
He was being silenced and intimidated. Okay, well, welcome, Xian Zhang. Welcome to Seattle, and please come to KUOW and do an interview very, very soon.
There we go.
Bellevue Arts Museum. Here's the bad news in the arts. Bellevue Arts Museum had an emergency fundraiser a few months ago, and they said they exceeded their goal, but they closed indefinitely this week. So that's a big arts organization taken out. The Nordstrom family teamed up this week with a Mexican department store chain to try to take the Nordstrom company private. You look...
Yeah.
What's that look on your face,
It's
Brian?
happened before. I was trying to
Yes.
get the breakdown on this and what this was all about.
Yeah, and they're offering, apparently I saw the Seattle Times pointed out that their offer of $3.8 billion is less than they were offering several years ago when that was considered too cheap back then. But they're trying. We don't know exactly why they're doing this. That's sort of the point of owning a company. You don't have to. You can stop explaining yourself. You don't have to respond to Wall Street pressure to keep quarterly earnings up. So we'll see whether since Nordstrom would own 50.1% and the rest would be owned by El Puerto de Liverpool.
Oh,
the Mexican department. That's the name of the department store chain. Okay, we got 2 minutes left. Those are some stuff that happened this week. What did anything make you smile this week?
I saw a great headline in Axios that I had to pass on. It was all about how Taylor Swift, you remember, had that big concert last year in July, and it was like the biggest Lumen Field, and it was the biggest like seismic event that the stadium had never had, even bigger than the Beast Quake with Marshawn Lynch running around. Yep. But then it was just reported that in August, when Ed Sheeran was there and brought Macklemore on the stage, that was an even bigger seismic event that was just released over this past week. So I don't know what that says about who rocked it more. I thought that was interesting. But it definitely lays down the gauntlet for Seahawks fans this weekend to try to get out there and maybe even make a bigger chunk of noise when the season opener happens with Denver in town.
Okay, out-rock Macklemore.
We'll see.
Seahawks fans.
You are an incredible optimist, Brian.
I wonder what the seismic reading is at Mariners Stadium.
Wait for it.
Now.
Yeah. Right.
I got a long list of things because I'm like, are we so back? We have
like 1 minute left.
The aquarium open, Linwood Link opens,
Yes.
like the library is back,
Right.
World Cup is coming, Madison G Line is coming. It just feels like it's like really excellent thing after excellent thing, and it makes me feel really excited to see that we can do awesome things.
Thank you for that. Anything, Bill? Well,
Peaches.
What
we were
about
told
peaches?
by the people that we always get peaches from they weren't likely to have a crop this year, and this week we got a call saying come get them, and we could get enough boxes for us, our friends, and 2 boxes for Mom to can. So peaches.
Okay, summer peaches. All right, then my smile is that because I'll go full circle. We talked about public lands at the start of the show. I watched videos of machines called burn bots, and there are 2 kind of machines. The first provides precision mastication. And these videos, it's like they're super goats on hillsides just mashing, chewing and mulching and getting rid of stuff that could burn. The other machine is a mobile burn trailer that slowly rolls over the brush. As it goes over, it ignites the brush inside a chamber, and then trailing behind it is a heavy roller that snuffs out the flame so they can run this next to... Have you been on roads where they're doing... They're just burning the brush and it's smoking. You can't see where you're driving, or they can do it next to houses. So I don't know if Washington uses this. I'm not a paid sponsor of BurnBot, but I could be, BurnBot. For all your precision mastication
Okay,
needs.
wait a minute.
Wow.
Wait a minute. Brought to you by, right.
I thought that was kind of cool. Maybe we can actually chew up some of this fuel and maybe burn a little less.
Yeah.
How about that?
Beautiful.
Here's hoping. Yeah.
Here's hoping. Okay, we got to go. I want to thank my panel. We've got Commute Seattle Executive Director Alex Hudson. Thank you, Alex.
It's a pleasure.
Seattle Channel host and producer and co-host of the Seattle News, Views, and Brews podcast. Thank you, Brian Callanan.
Thanks for having me.
And former Port of Seattle Commissioner, now a Tacoma Tribune and Spokane Inlander columnist, Bill Bryant. Thank you, Bill.
Anytime. Thank you.
Thank you, producer Kevin Kniestedt and Kevin Deers running the board. We got to go. I'm Bill Radke. I look forward to doing this again next week on Week in Review.
Support for KUOW